We've been asked to address the topic, future conditions for maximum value, and to really kind of in a way jump off from where Robert ended in going forward and in thinking about this topic. Wow. And then the video, the pace of change that's going on around the world, and we think about how all the different jurisdictions around the world are struggling with IFRS and what to do with that and going forward. And some people moving a little bit quicker than others, but all of us having that good and open, honest debate. In our country, we're having not only that discussion, but discussion about private reporting. But it brings to mind the notion that it's important to understand right at the outset what the bedrock of the authority of the private sector standard setter is, and make sure that the governance is in place, because I think that's been one of the issues that we're grappling with here, at least in the U.S., and making sure that there is a linkage to regulatory oversight. I would submit that without that linkage, that you really don't have a standard. And part of that regulatory oversight has to take into account what the national interest is and what the global interest is. And a strong argument, as Robert points out, is that global interest. And as the world becomes smaller and as we are dealing with one another on a more regular basis, what does it mean for cross-border practice and regulation, and how do we identify the bad apples in the barrel and deal with that unfortunate aspect of our profession? But just being a little bit more granular, I might mention just a few things. We have a new chairman of the PCAOB in the United States, Jim Doty, and he's raised some important questions, I believe, recently. The PCAOB has raised some questions about the value of the audit following the crisis that occurred back in 2008. And for the most part, I don't believe that auditors have been blamed for what happened. But on the other hand, there are questions about, well, if 404 was supposed to be the answer to all of our problems after Sarbanes-Oxley was adopted, how come it was that we weren't identifying poor risk management on behalf of the financial institutions, and particularly in the area of going concern, when we were seeing financial statements coming out and no going concern, and then just several months later, people filing for bankruptcy. Chairman Doty has raised, again, questions about independence. And I think there are appropriate questions about auditor objectivity. The notion of professional skepticism has been raised by the IAASB, our various auditing standards board. And what it really kind of translates to me is when you talk about professional skepticism, are you really talking about impaired independence in fact? And it kind of creeps into the whole scenario of what we're talking about in a very subtle way. We have auditing firms discussing about how they're trusted business advisors, how they can help their clients structure transactions, how, the notion of a value-added audit. And then before long, we're back into this discussion of, well, are the services being provided in the non-audit area appropriate, and how does that really enhance audit quality? So I think that's a good topic to reopen 10 years after the scandals in the early part of the 2000s, 2001, 2002. And somebody recently brought to my attention professional journals. And you open professional journals and you see a lot about, well, practice development and how, how to become more, profitable. And not so many articles about audit quality. And that because I think audit quality is a much difficult issue to get your arms around. You really have to think about it. It's hard to define audit quality. I know on the Treasury Committee, Rick, we had a real struggle with that. What does audit quality mean? It means different things to different people, and it takes a lot of work to really get there. And I know that the various standard setters are working a great deal on that. And in fact, the next thing I might mention, and I don't want to get too far into it because I know Dan Gelser's going to want to talk about it, is the standard audit report. They've got a concept release out there on that, and IAASB has been working on the standard audit report, and it could fundamentally change the things within the profession like we haven't seen in any time in the recent past, and I think that's a recognition that for too long we've been setting standards and we've been going forward focusing on what the suppliers of our profession want to put out there instead of the users or the consumers. And basically what I'm saying is that the investors need to have more of a voice. And I believe that thinking back in my business school days on marketing, you have to apply those marketing concepts of knowing who your user is, who the customer is. And the customer is saying, they want transparency. They want information that they can rely on. And cost isn't necessarily the most important factor. They simply want to be able to know that when a company says these are our assets, this is our results of operation, they can believe it. I don't want to get too far down the line here, but a whole lot of other things going on. At the same time, we have this green paper in the EU raising some of the same sorts of questions. The report that came out from the House of Lords that I think was right on target on a lot of things. But Rick, I'm going to turn some time over to you because I think I've rambled on here a lot.
Thank you, Gaylen. You do a lot of things, but rambling isn't one of them. Michael, thank you for the introduction, and I thank NASBA for the opportunity to return. I assume that's because I either said something useful that I didn't recognize 2 years ago, or I said something particularly foolish that makes a wonderful foil for these discussions. You can tell me afterwards which it was. I think we all come together to share a goal that's easily articulated. We want consistently high-quality auditing as a sustainable global resource of maximum value. The importance of that proposition has not been in doubt. It has been in debate for 40 years with various studies, projects, controversies in the U.S. and elsewhere since the early 1970s. For a long while, those discussions and debates focused on financial reporting as it relates primarily to issuer-investor relationships. The financial crisis we've been through demonstrates that the stage is much larger than that. It encompasses the health of the capital markets and the stability of the global economy. So, as Gaylen says, there are many attention centers being focused on the goal I just described at this point in time. Healthy that it is that many, complicated to sort them all out. I think we are, however, at an inflection point where this time there will be consequences to this debate, and they will either move us toward the goal or away from it. The introductory video, I thought, set the scene awfully well in describing us as poised at that turning point with the capacity to make it better. The aspect I'd like to focus on in a few minutes of introductory comments is the sustainability of the goal, the sustainability of high-quality global audit services. And sustainability is very often in these debates used symmetrically with issues of audit liability. And the question of whether or not audit liability represents a threat to the sustainability or a vital component of assuring sustainability of those resources. This is an issue that has produced some very difficult, blunt instrument debates, and it is an issue that links into most of the other major questions that will come before the rest of this conference and before the work all of you are doing in your centers of activity. The Treasury ACAP debate or on the subject probably captured the difficulty very well. That report produced a great deal of value that is just beginning to emerge for the influence it ought to have on the ongoing dialogues in many respects. But one thing we failed to do was reach any consensus around sustainability and the role of liability of auditors in achieving that goal. In fact, we came to a well-articulated declaration of enormous conflict of opinion. I don't mean to overstate the point, but I think if you boil down the pages of that report in which the two positions were laid out, one position fundamentally said auditors are not trustworthy, that they will serve their own purposes rather than public purposes unless there is a robust system of liability risk and regulatory enforcement hanging over them with a whip to see that they behave well. Another view is that auditors are professionals determined to make the very best of their competency and resources for the public good, but constrained from delivering the value they're capable of because of the fear and business implications of excess liability risks that inhibit their ability to do so. The conflict that's articulated there is well stated, but it's unfortunately at a very blunt stage that doesn't take one down to the point of understanding the components of the question and trying to move it forward in the ways that Robert has so well described the work of the group whose report he presented. It seems to me that in order to get at the core of this issue, which is a threshold to so many of the other critical issues of the day, requires us to take a look at the who, what, and how of the audit liability issue. Who are auditors? What are audit firms? And how can regulators make a contribution on the right side of the ledger? I'll share my perspectives on those three questions. I am confident of only one thing, which is that my perspective is not necessarily universally held. Who are auditors? Having worked inside the profession or leading the insurance programs that have covered the profession throughout most of my career, I am comfortable and proud to view auditors as dedicated professionals committed to a service that they chose to take on as their career, much as doctors, public officials, and other professionals have done. Auditors fall short of perfection, as does every other human system. I've lived decades seeing the warts of those imperfections and seeing the courage that overcomes what would otherwise have been many other warts. I believe auditors are soundly motivated. I have seen my partners imprisoned and in a couple of cases murdered for holding to their dedicated view of how financial behavior had to be reported in parts of the world where those views were not appreciated. Fortunately, I think the brutality period of audit exposure is gone, but it's been replaced by the liability risk period. What are audit firms other than being comprised of these kinds of individuals? They are of various sizes and characteristics, but they are organized around the requirements of meeting the needs of their clients in the way their clients are organized, whether it's massively global, whether it's local, whether it's local with dependency on trade flows and capital flows across borders. Audit firms mirror the complexity of the economy they're examining. And they are firms. They are required to be successful businesses if they are going to endure and sustain and deliver the value they're capable of doing. They have to succeed. They do so in a difficult environment where they are precluded by regulation from being universally owned and therefore more routinely controlled. They are precluded from accepting third-party investment, which stabilizes the economy of the business and allows reasonable risk-taking in the pursuit of their goals. And they are burdened by the diversity of the world they serve. I thought, again, Robert's comments are enormously helpful in describing the challenge ahead for audit as one that requires flexibility and adaptability of both auditor and regulator, because there are cross currents of legitimate objectives to be dealt with, and that results in the need for multiple difficult judgments to be made. That is the world in which the audit firm struggles to find its way and to find its way with sustainability. The how of audit regulation that influences this environment, again, for the sake of brevity, let me take an overly simplified and blunt description. Audit regulators can, at one extreme end of the perspective, view themselves as responsible for creating a procedurally focused world or regime in which following the rules, or as the EU Parliament Committee recently referred to it, the tick-the-box approach to audit regulation, and that was not a flattering reference because that committee reached the conclusion, as Robert has well described it, that there are simply too much subtlety of judgment and nuance of decision ahead for the audit profession to remain measured by and challenged only with respect to the procedural aspects. Audit regulators at the other end of the spectrum can, and I hope will, attempt to support the professionalism of the audit businesses and auditors who are carrying out these responsibilities by providing space for reasoned, thoughtful judgments, attempting to achieve the goals that Robert's report outlines, with a recognition that not every judgment is going to be proven right in the course of history, and that there is room for well-reasoned, well-processed decisions to be made in these cross-currents of influence without being held to the standards of being either right or legally responsible for the consequences. I'll close with just a couple of comments about where I see the liability issue influencing the aspects of activity that I've talked briefly about. One could make the case that there has never been a showing that private sector liability, or the risk of it, enhances the quality of audit. I know of no empirical evidence to suggest that. I would point out the frequency with which people in public office maintain that they must be protected by sovereign immunity so that they are free to exercise their judgments freely and fairly. I do find some inconsistency between the sovereign immunity of the regulatory community and the high liability that some of that community would impose upon the audit profession. But audit liability is here to stay. I'm not going to waste your time in railing against its existence. I would suggest that it is a universal phenomenon. Let me quickly run through where audit liability has taken its toll over the last few decades, because I think it's an underappreciated fact. In the 1970s, and I'm basing my measurements on the standard of the proportion of audit liability expense relative to either the population or the GDP of a country. In the 1970s, audit liability headquarters were in the US and the UK. In the 80s, Australia, Hong Kong, and Switzerland took over first place in that category. In the 90s, the honor went to the US, Canada, and Europe. And in the current decade and century, we are seeing the US, the UK, and the BRIC countries lead the way. We are dealing with a global and mobile phenomenon. The proposition I would leave you with is that auditors ought to be liable for the consequences of their lack of diligent effort and reasoned judgment when that produces mistakes that cause adverse consequences to parties who rely on the auditor's work. There should no longer be a debate about whether there is liability. The focus ought to be on two things: getting rid of the excess quantum of liability. Auditors shouldn't be held to account for paying for the overheated capital market valuation placed on securities. They should be held to account for the work done on the financial information contained in financial reports. Auditors shouldn't be held to account under joint and several liability theories for the flaws of everyone else involved in the commercial transaction that may have gone wrong. Auditors shouldn't, in effect, be held to strict liability on the be right or be responsible. They should operate like virtually every other professional or business enterprise on the basis that there is a role of being honorably wrong for which no devastating liability consequences will result. and auditors shouldn't be held vicariously liable across national boundaries for the work of networked participants in their organization, at least so long as there are regulatory barriers that prevent audit organizations from operating under a wholly owned and effectively controlled universal system. With a few reasonable constraints of that kind, capping not being one of them, the hazards of liability will be contained. They will nevertheless be hazards that still threaten the sustainability of the business models of audit firms, large and small, more so large, but it is spreading through the profession as a whole. And I will stop there because it seems to me that's the threshold of the issues that really count. What set of conditions relating to the liability of auditors will enhance quality and permit and encourage the profession to take on some of the broader roles of judgment formation and report articulation that are being asked of it today?
Thank you, Rick. Can everybody hear me? All right. Thank you, Rick and Gaylen, for your comments. I think we want to kind of start out with a few questions. And my first question is for either Rick or Gaylen because you both touched upon the subject. But Rick, I'm going to refer to a comment that you made that from a report, I believe, that auditors are constrained from delivering the value. And then you go on to share something about risk. So I'm hearing in your opening remarks a lot of risk talk weaved throughout your comments. Then we talk about independence. So I'm trying to put all of this together from where we sit as regulators. And I'm wondering if the audit firms, there's a lot of risk involved in audits, right? Yes, everybody agrees with that. So a lot of risk involved with audits, a lot of potential legal liability. So it seems like the audit firms are expanding their non-audit services to kind of, I guess, spread the risk, make sure they have a managed or a balanced portfolio. How long can that continue? How can auditors be, I guess, penalized for trying to do the right thing and trying to be independent? And there are just a lot of inconsistencies, and if you all can comment on that and maybe try to help us understand better.
Well, I promise not to answer all your questions so that you have some of the morning left. Let's start with a simple proposition. The audit report, as we know it today, offers as little value for as much money as any single product that any industry offers the world. And that is not an accident. There are some historical roots to it. But it is the product of this delicate balance of how much can an auditor afford to say without being held to even greater hazards of liability, because with every nuance that might be introduced into the audit report comes a new level of risk. We are at the point today where very responsible regulatory bodies, the U.S. being one of them, and elsewhere, are saying we need more of the auditor. We need to know more about what the auditor knows. We need to know why the auditors didn't foresee the difficulty of transactions in securities and securitized products a few years ago. Every one of those expectations carries with it a multiplier effect of the potential liability that has forced the report to be so narrow and of so little value. So if we are going to demand more of the audit profession to use its expertise and its knowledge to better enlighten those who depend upon the accuracy and soundness of financial reporting, then we've got to find a way to facilitate and foster that without killing the goose while you're trying to fatten it. I'll stop there and invite Gaylen's comments.
Yeah, on this issue of non-audit services, that's an interesting one that you raised, Linda, because it would almost seem to me that firms, when they're facing liability and considering independence, that they would almost want to shed any aspect of a conflict of interest, and I think the discussions that we've had, at least on the ethics board here in the U.S., has been, can't somebody else do this work? I mean, why does the auditor have to do all this stuff? And like you say, Rick, we need more of the auditor, and I think that's kind of what we're going to hear from Dan a little bit later on this audit reporting model, where people want to know more about those judgments and estimates and the quality of the accounting policies. That's what they want to hear about, and instead there's this notion that the auditor has to be all things to all people. Well, in the U.S., we've kind of looked at these non-audit services and said they're not all the same, and you're going to have some that just outright need to be prohibited, and there are those that say all of them should be prohibited. You get into the private reporting world, and there's a framework of recognizing that you're dealing with very small businesses that really do rely on their accountant to perform many things for them, and I think you'd probably have to agree that that's really a different arena. But even there, a heightened concern about the overall independence and skepticism of the auditor. And are they being hired to be an auditor, or are they being hired to be part of management? Fundamentally, I think that's the question.
If I could add just one quick comment, but I think it captures much of your questions, Linda. I'll make a statement which you can accept as an act of faith, or you can be very upset about. But I believe firmly that the audit revenues and audit profits available today in the way this business is constructed are far insufficient to support the audit liability that goes with that stream of revenue. So if you had an audit-only firm, it would quickly die of excess liability burdens, because you can't make money, you can't attract the people, you can't keep partners from doing it. So much of the diversification of service is not driven by how do we become something that isn't an auditor. It's driven by how do we support and sustain the ability to continue being an auditor.
If I might add on to, and I think those are good points, Rick, but I might add on to that. And we've had a project at NASBA, and I know that there's a number of other people around the world have had the same issue, as fierce fee cutting in the U.S. At almost every level. I've talked to Brian Hunt in Canada. He's the CEO of the Canadian Public Accountability Board, the CPAB, and he said the same thing. Big time fee cutting. So, what's the impact of that on independence and professionalism? I think that leads into exactly what you're talking about, and I happen to agree with you. Linda, what else do we have here?
Well, yeah, I was going to go further down that path, but I think I'll stop. Again, from a regulatory viewpoint, I'm thinking about prescriptive. Rick, I think you mentioned, from a regulatory viewpoint, there is consideration of prescriptive versus judgmental regulation. And you explained both. Prescriptive is just the box checking, and judgment, I mean, we all understand what judgment is, but I worked as a regulator, and I understand prescriptive. I understand following the rules. But if you were to tell me that I have to judgmentally regulate the CPAs in Tennessee, how would I do that? How does that happen?
My comments were too, again, too blunt. There is no one right model of principles-based regulation versus prescriptive-based regulation. The space in between those extremes is where the ratcheting of planning needs to be made. Those who do not trust auditors to be dedicated professionals would ratchet that position more toward the prescriptive end so that you are assured that at least the right steps are being taken. Those who have a higher sense of the professionalism of auditing would shift the ratchet a bit and say, I want to invite you to take the risk of expressing your opinion, and I want to provide you, as a regulator, want to provide you with some guidance on the extent to which your judgments can be framed inside a range of non-devastating risk consequences. We're really setting the stage for Dan Gelser this morning, I think, because one of the proposed exposure draft comments of the summer from the PCAOB, a very interesting one, is to say maybe we want to ask an audit firm to include in its report a list of the several things the auditor identifies as the most difficult or marginal judgments that the issuer has made in presenting its financial statements. That's a brilliant way to get better information into the public. It is a terrifying way to invite the early destruction of the profession.
Gaylen, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I have to tell you that, if you by box ticking you mean mechanical, I would agree. That can be a hazard and one that we should avoid. But frankly, if I'm going into heart surgery, I want that physician there using a checklist, making sure that everything's taken care of. And pilots do that. So from that standpoint, I don't mind a little bit of box ticking. It sort of reminds me a little bit of this principles versus rules thing. There's a place for both. And I don't mind being reminded, hey, have you thought about that? And check that baby off. I think the key is if you thought about it, and what thought is behind it. So from that standpoint, I guess I'm a box ticker.
I think we've got time. I want to ask one more question, and Gaylen, I'm gonna serve this one up. Oh. Okay, sure. Go ahead.
As I listened to the conversation that morphed into the question of independence, I couldn't help but touch back on that you're using the word auditor as a noun as opposed to a verb. There isn't anything, I don't know if you can use the word auditor. It's an accountant that does auditing, that works for an accounting firm. Be it a CPA firm or a chartered accounting firm, they're a part of a larger organization. And as you did point out, the conflict of interest, in part independence issue of doing not audit work is of interest. But as we're going to international standards and this convergence, most of the accounting firms in this world also practice law. We in the United States do not. As I've read the literature and the prognosis on what's going to happen, I've not seen any comment on if that might be a reasonable movement area that we might find worldwide that the CPA firms move into as they have in Europe, planet-wide as opposed to just a few countries. And I don't know another body besides you that would have a better sense on if this is a foreseeable change that we might expect or how it ties into the whole movement.
Well, I think if I understand your question are we going to follow what some of the world is doing as far as practicing law? Is it going to become part of the accounting profession? I would hope not. I remember a few years back when I started doing a little bit of litigation support and becoming an expert witness, and I've done that for some period of time, and I told the senior partner in our firm, I said, well, I'm thinking about going back to law school. He said, no, you are not. You've been taught to be independent. You think differently from an attorney. No offense to any of the attorneys out there, but our thought process needs to be different, and our focus needs to be independent. And an attorney is an advocate, is not intended to be an independent person. But that's just sort of my reaction to, I think, what your question is getting at. The bedrock of our profession is independence, and it needs to be different from what an advocate has.
Gaylen, I absolutely agree, and I take the thought one step farther. How much independence do people really want when they ask for independence? Clearly independence from the client, independence from the controlling stakeholders, if there are any. But do we also want auditors to be independent from the political economic liturgy of the day? And maybe I'll say nothing more after this, Linda, because I probably shouldn't. Let us suppose we took this to the extreme and listened to the voices who said, where were the auditors in anticipation of the financial crisis when securitized instruments were becoming, by hindsight, clearly weapons of mass destruction? Why weren't you the profession who understood and had the independent spirit and the objectivity of view to say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense? What would have happened if in the 2006 and 2007 financial reports of many of the world's major banks, the auditor had issued a going concern qualification on the basis that there is so much uncertainty and risk associated with dealing in instruments we don't understand that we won't approve these accounts cleanly? What would have been the reaction of regulators, politicians, economists, managers of the world's enterprises for that degree of independence? And it seems to me that illustrates one of the challenging questions for regulators. How closely do you want to align with assisting the profession in actually being fully independent of every source and objective on every issue?
Okay, John?
Securitized debt instruments. I remember in 1993, 94, as I was a partner in one of the big four, well, it was big six then, big six firms, saying, this stuff doesn't make sense. And I think there was agreement amongst my peers in all the firms that there were problems. The next issue is how you get the ball rolling to unravel this. This is great, that why not 12 years later, we pull the plug and do a lot of the things that you said. But there are so many steps in between being able to, in your gut feel, some issues do not make a lot of sense, but then trying to deal with it in a very complex, fast international economy. And so I think those are some of the challenges, and there are going to be other problems like this in the future. So all I'm saying is the profession, in one sense, was not asleep. In another sense, it was the whole issue of what is it able to do? How is it able to cope with all of this?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and that's going to come from Kevin Dancy.
Thanks, Linda.
You're welcome.
I spent most of my career in the game, and for the last part of it, ran one of the largest firms in Canada. It is a complex business on one level, but on another level, it's not. Keys to audit quality are, first, you have to make sure we always attract the right people in. So as you look at issues around liability, as you look at issues around what the perspective and role of the regulator is, make sure you always ask the question, will we always attract the right people in? Because I can tell you that a lot of the large firms right now are quite worried that they're not getting the right people into the audit side. Second thing is that to do a quality audit, you really have to understand the business. So as you look at the whole issue of non-audit services, what auditors can and cannot do, make sure you don't go so far so that they don't understand the business. Because if they don't understand the business, you will not get a quality audit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, I want to thank Rick and Gaylen for those wonderful comments, and thank you all for participating.